masterful account of the presidential election of 1960, in which the Catholicism of Senator John Kennedy figured prominently, Theodore White concluded, and I quote, "The presidency hovers over the popular American imagination almost as a sacerdotal office, a priestly role for which normal political standards are invalid." Another scholar has added that, quote, "The election of a president is an almost religious task. It intimately affects the life of the spirit, our very identity." As you all know, Article 6 of the Constitution declares that no religious test shall be allowed for holding political office in the United States. However, it clearly is, or at least appears to be, the case that no serious candidate for the White House can even run the risk of violating our religious political norm that one can be, or to the cynic, appears to be, religious. And moreover, the candidate should be not just religious, but acceptably religious. For it does appear to be the case that we do have a religious litmus test concerning the American presidency. And in speaking of the American presidency, I have to speak first of all about Lyndon Johnson. And this actually, I've been told, is a true story involving Lyndon Johnson. He was once at the White House preparing for a meal, and he asked his assistant, Bill Moyers, who was a Baptist minister, to say grace before the meal. And Moyers proceeded to say grace. Johnson interrupted him, thundering, "Moyers, I can't hear you. Speak up." And Moyers said, "Sir, I wasn't speaking to you." So that was Johnson's litmus test. We've had other litmus tests of sorts. For example, in the election of 1800, Reverend Timothy Dwight, president of Yale University, warned Americans, "If Jefferson is elected, the Bible will be burned, the French Marseillaise will be sung in Christian churches, and we may see our wives and daughters the victims of legal prostitution, soberly dishonored and speciously polluted." The last Unitarian president was William Howard Taft, who faced allegations of heresy during the 1908 campaign. Some in the American electorate still question the religious bona fides of President Obama, in spite of his numerous and public statements about his Christian beliefs and religious journey. And of course, in this year's election, the membership in the LDS Church of Governor Romney has figured prominently. For example, in the Washington Post on May 17th of this year, Lisa Miller wrote, "It would not be an exaggeration to say that when you pull a lever this November, you will not just be voting for president. You will be saying what you believe about God." For example, Romney and his focus on individualism, President Obama and his focus on communitarianism. Randall Balmer, professor of American Religious History at Barnard College at Columbia University and a student of the American presidency, cautions against seeing the election of a candidate, especially one's own, as a harbinger of the Second Coming. Balmer argues, "The introduction of religious language and faith claims into presidential politics raises an important question. And that question is, so what? Does a candidate's faith or even his moral character make any substantive difference in how he governs? Does ethical earnestness translate into an effective presidency? Do spiritual disciplines make one a great president?" According to Balmer, and I quote, "If we persist in vetting the faith of our presidential candidates, we must find a way to reinvest both religion and the political process with a profundity befitting the importance of both." And yes, this is a very shameless plug. A colleague of mine and I have written a book about presidents and religion. He's here tonight, and I won't embarrass him by making him stand, but as we once said, he said I wrote the chapters on the Democrats and he wrote the chapters on Christians. Don't agree on that. But I was interviewed this week, we both were interviewed by a writer from Slate magazine, and the question was, who's the most religious president, who's been the most religious president, and who's been the least religious president? We answered the questions, and then I thought later, well, how do you know? How do you know who's the most religious? How do you know who's the least religious? Does it make a difference? This one thing I know. Presidential candidates are not going to quit talking about religion anytime soon. They're going to continue to make professions of personal piety or statements about their faith. It might be nice if they didn't. There are times when I would rather hear less about their religion and more about their policy positions. are times when I don't care that much of where they go to church or how often they go to church or with whom they go to church. We've had presidents all across the board. And honestly, I think my favorite, whatever that means, I know it sounds like an ice cream flavor or coffee difference, but my favorite president happens to be Abraham Lincoln, who was one of our least conventionally religious presidents and arguably our most theologically sophisticated president. So I don't think presidential candidates are going to quit using religious rhetoric anytime soon. I think the challenge is for us voters to call them on their language when they use that language. So that if they say, here's one reason why you should vote for me, I'm X, I want to know what difference that's going to make with respect to their policy positions. You can say, I go to church on a regular basis, but you ask for that one more drone attack. Or you can say something like, Jesus Christ is my favorite philosopher, and isn't waterboarding a grand thing? So I think the key reality is that when it comes to the use of religious rhetoric, it's probably not a wise thing to try to divest the public square of religious rhetoric. However, religious rhetoric should not be seen as something that trumps rational debate, persuasion, seeking common aims, and using common language. So if a presidential candidate wishes to use religious language, I have no particular quarrel with that. I don't think that violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. But if that candidate uses religious language and then gets criticized for it or challenged for it, he or she can't then call for, well, I'm being persecuted. If you put something like that on the table, you then should be expected to say, well, if you are, as say Jimmy Carter said in 1976, if you are born again, and my most important relationship in my life is Jesus Christ, you should be expected to be asked, how does that matter politically? And be able to explain it in a way that other people can understand, especially if they're not part of your religious faith or have no faith at all. Again, Lincoln, I think, put it best. If you read his Meditation on the Divine Will from September of 1862, or especially if you read his second inaugural address, you see Lincoln claiming a belief in divine providence or the Almighty, trying to make sense of things, claiming that, as he put it, the will of God prevails, yet the war goes on, and we try to make sense of things. I think that was a very admirable way of putting one's doubts as well as one's convictions without claiming that you're God's victor on earth.
Okay, our next panelist is Dr. Jasmine Cows.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. I want to follow up on one of Dr. Smith's initial points, where he talked about the old saying where you're not supposed to talk about religion and or politics in polite company. I come from a blue-collar Roman Catholic family, and basically all the talk in my home was about religion and politics. But then no one ever accused the Lacalzi family of being polite company either. That was from my dad. I was mulling about this subject when a few weeks ago, especially, came to me when looking at the disturbances and riots, whatever you want to call them, in Benghazi and the Middle East. And looking at what was going on, I don't see it as a Samuel Huntington clash of civilizations. I didn't see it as a religious confrontation between Christianity and Islam. I saw a broader political schism that's not just international, but really systemic. I think the confrontations we see in the Middle East today concerning videos and all is in most respects really political economy. Of course, I think by my discipline, I think most things are political economy. But what I really see is this is a real conflict between individual rights and societal responsibilities. And this goes back at least to those who would be called a classic liberals, following John Locke, versus the classic conservatives, who my colleague Curry Hunter would say goes back to Plato. But then he says everything goes back to Plato. But it could, at least the classic conservatives, we could say, goes back to Edmund Burke. But you could also see this dichotomy from a strictly philosophical approach. Maybe as my colleague, Professor Greg McElwain would say, that this is really John Rawls's rights versus Alistair McIntyre's virtues. And if you look in the United States, this is really from the end of the 18th century. This is Thomas Jefferson versus Alexander Hamilton. And it really runs through this individual rights versus societal responsibility, the whole political economy of the country. And I brought a book with me today, which I'm almost halfway done. And this is Michael Lynn. It's called Land of Promise, an Economic History of the United States. Should more properly be called a political economy history of the United States. But he shows how this dichotomy runs through our whole country, from Jefferson to Hamilton to Jackson and throughout. But I also see, to get back more to politics and religion, is conflict also between the Bill of Rights and the Ten Commandments. The Bill of Rights it's about rights. But it's really looks at protections of the individual from government, though government really is an institutionalization of society. So we look at the Bill of Rights, it's really what society should not do to the individual. It's Congress, they say Congress, we might as well say society. Congress shall pass no law. But now let's look at the Ten Commandments, at least how I interpret them. It's the protection of society from the individual. It's what individuals are not supposed to do to society. Thou, the individual, shall not bear false witness. Thou shall not kill. This conflict is also, shameless plug, a subject of research that I'm beginning to look into, and its prevalence in today's politics, and especially how it can be seen in the state of Idaho, and I believe broadly into our whole country. And it's a look at what's called two political subcultures. And I get that theory from my former professor at Temple University, Daniel Elazar. And if you look at it here in Idaho, but really across the country, there's the individualistic subculture. There are libertarians that we see. That's North Idaho. That's the Idaho Freedom Foundation. But we also have in our state a moralistic subculture. They're the communitarians, as Steve mentioned. That's Eastern Idaho. That's the LDS and our other churches. This dichotomy is a problem, has been a problem for both the Democrats and the Republicans, define them both quite broadly, really ever since the New Deal. Because you have the Democrats tend to be individualistic on social issues. Society shouldn't tell me who I can marry, yet moralistic on economic issues, that it's up to society to care for those less advantaged. Yet Republicans look more moralistically on social issues. We as society must put prayer into school, but individualistic on economic issues. The government, society, should not be involved in economic decisions and economic regulations. We see this conflict now in various political issues. I think it was very prominent amongst the Republicans in our last Idaho State Legislative session. The proposed bill requiring ultrasounds before abortion split the Republican Party in the state because it was a split that I've been speaking of. It was society trying to protect life versus the individual trying to be protected from coercion of government or society. So I see today that conflicts are not politics versus religion. And again, maybe it's a disciplinary bias, but I see it as a clash between political ideologies. That what we see mostly today are individual rights versus societal responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasper. Our next presenter is Dr. Brent Peterson.
Thank you. The phrase is commonly asserted, your faith has no place in the public square, or don't mix your religion and your politics. When expressing opinions on issues such as immigration, healthcare, same-sex marriage, the economy, taxes, foreign policy, is it right and even possible for people to leave religion out of it? If I were to title my remarks, they would be not the separation of church and state, but the state as a religious institution and politicians as religious proselytizers. My primary thesis is that much legislation, and thus all politicians, are inherently religious, not because of their positions on ideas, but because many conclusions come from distinct epistemologies that are given authority to by faith. Therefore, to remove religion from politics is to remove people from politics. The phrase separation of church and state has roots to Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist Association, 1802, where he writes, quote, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declare that their legislature should, First Amendment, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And then the phrase where we get our separation of church and state, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. As a theologian, I have some questions for Jefferson and the First Amendment. As I read them, both of these statements are false. If my religion tells me to kill persons with blue eyes and blonde hair because they are a threat to the world, Congress would not let me freely exercise my religion. Stephen Carter suggests it is quite an illusion to suggest the state does not impose morality on anyone else. Every law is making a moral judgment. My colleague Steve Shaw suggested one of my many problems is that I'm reading this too literally and not closely enough. He pointed to the 1940 case of Cantwell versus Connecticut, which affirms something also true for Jefferson and Madison. This is what he said to me. The freedom of belief is absolute. You can believe whatever you want, but freedom of action is not absolute. Look at Jefferson's phrase again, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship. The legitimate powers of government reach actions only, not opinions. It appears religion is defined as opinions or ideas, but those opinions can never shape any embodied action that are contrary to the law or of the state. I do think this idea of religion is prevalent, and I think it's not helpful. I want to expand what we mean by religion. So first I want to say all persons are religious. Every person who claims a position on many issues bases such reasoning on some metaphysical narrative that is derived from an epistemology given authority to by faith. Hence, all persons and most laws are religious. Carter mostly agrees with me. Quote, the considered moral judgments of citizens are often informed by religious belief, end quote. Secondly, I would suggest that true religion is not disembodied ideas in one's head, but true religion is that which is embodied in one's actions. So in this expansion, I want to refute the claim of neutral universal reason. This fall, atheist.org put up several billboards to challenge and critique both President Obama and Governor Romney over their faith. Their slogan is simple: atheism, simply reasonable. If we were to believe the logic of atheist.org, we'd better to govern people simply by the use of objectified reason. Yet, where does one's reason come from? The last 150 years of neuroscience, philosophy, and theology has taught us that philosophical neutrality is problematic at best. It is often claimed that rational humans, despite different faiths, will agree on the universal truths and goods to find the one right answer. Richard Rorty suggested this is how the Enlightenment justified pushing religion to the private sector. Rorty notes the Enlightenment proposed that, quote, religion may perhaps be tolerated as relevant to and possibly essential for individual perfection, but it must nevertheless be considered irrelevant to the social order, since it is not common to all human beings qua human beings, end quote. Conversely, Rorty claims that this, quote, the rationalist justification of the Enlightenment compromise with religion has been discredited, end quote. J. Judd Owen, in his book, Religion and the Demise of Liberal Rationalism, the Foundational Crisis of the Separation of Church and State, suggests that at the core of liberalism is faith. Owen recalls Nietzsche's anti-foundationalism that attempted to undermine liberalism's normative universal reason. Nietzsche's anti-foundationalism asserted that, here's a longer quote from Owen, no claim to knowledge is founded in the one truth. All claims to knowledge are from a particular human and all too human perspective, or are socially constructed. There is nothing to which we can appeal in order to settle the most profound human disagreements, and thus there is no possibility that the awesome variety of conflicting opinions about the things most important to human beings, including the best political order, can be transcended toward universal and objective knowledge. The original claim that liberalism is grounded in natural right and reason, and therefore the claim that it is universally legitimate, are naive and arrogant factions, end quote. Ultimately, all political positions rest on competing faiths. Frederick Geddix and Roger Hendricks suggest secularism, or foundational rationalism, is simply a prescription for the disease of religious pluralism. Geddix calls for a post-secular politics. Instead of the metaphor of the separation of church and state, which are not mutually exclusive, what the, quote, what the public culture needs are ways of talking about religion, church and state, and public and private life, which unify rather than divide. Does this lead us only to a theocracy? No. Actually, Geddix and Hendricks want real liberalism, where they decide where all voices are heard, recognizing these voices are all religious. Of course, some on the religious right embrace a similar dogmatic epistemology. Instead of universal natural reason, they have the Bible. Yet they do not really embrace faith in Jesus, only foundational absolute truths that they come up with about Jesus. Whatever we mean by left and right, liberal, conservative, my hope is that we can all listen and engage in dialogue with each other without claiming exclusivity of truth. Martin Luther King Jr. in the Civil Rights Movement, Oscar Romero as a liberation theologian, also serve as examples of the necessity of faith in the public square. The movements pointed to what they believed God desired for humanity. Carter's primary thesis, I think, mostly supports mine, at least so I think. Quote, for if a citizen is told that access to the public square is available on a privileged basis to those fortunate enough to have reasoned their way to moral conclusions without the benefit of religious consideration, then it truly is demanding. Even before the conversation begins, there's a separation of church and self, end quote. In other words, you can remove religion from the politics. In so doing, you'll also remove yourself.
Next up is Dr. Mia Kim.
And we are moving to Latin America. And I'm going to read my papers because I have a tendency to ramble. This way, I keep it to 7 minutes. For many in Latin America, liberation theology offered a framework to challenge political oppression and the violence of poverty. Inspired in part by Vatican II, theologians like Ernesto Cardenal, Leonardo Bosch, Helder Camara, Gustavo Gutierrez, and Oscar Romero, among many others, criticized and challenged the global socioeconomic system that they argued perpetuated structural inequality and oppression. The movement attracted passionate supporters as well as detractors. With the enthronement of Pope John Paul II in 1978, the Vatican silenced multiple liberation theologians who were accused of political activism in defiance of their religious obligations and duties. This debate concerns what is acceptable for Catholic clergy and laity. Acceptable action for Catholic clergy and laity. As Archbishop Helder Camara summarized, when I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the people are poor, they call me a communist. Vatican II marked the transition of the Catholic Church from a European into a global church. For the most populous Catholic region in the world, Vatican II initiated what political scientist Edward Cleary called the Latin Americanization of the Church. The final document of the Council, Gaudium et Spes, declared that the church had a responsibility to act in the world on behalf of the poor. Further, the church declared that the poor had a right to, quote, a share of earthly goods sufficient for oneself and one's family. Finally, the Vatican Council's methodology of facts, reflection, and recommendation prompted a shift in perspective from dogmatic and top-down to one that was exploratory, inductive, and bottom to top. For many Latin American Catholics, Vatican II was the beginning of an uprooting of Latin Americans from their European theological soil, so that while still connected to Europe, the Latin American church asserted itself as differently informed. It was in this context that liberation theology was born. A theological movement born of Latin America's unique historical experience. Liberation theology attempted to address the question of poverty through community organization, Christian action, and theological contemplation as embodied in the Christian basic communities, praxis, and the preferential option for the poor. The question of why is there so much poverty in Latin America led to a Marxist critique of the exclusionary and exploitive global economic system. The use of Marxist analysis by liberation theologists deeply divided the church. As Colloquium priest Alfonso Lopez Trujillo argued, theology can and should make use of social sciences. However, it cannot concede validity to the Marxist analysis of society or to the dialectical interpretation of history. For many critics, Marxist analysis invalidated liberation theology. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger argued, the phenomena of liberation theology reveals that it constitutes a fundamental threat to the faith of the church. Pointing to what he called the Marxist orientation of liberation theology, he condemned the bastardization of the biblical poor into the proletariat in the Marxist sense, and that liberation theologians justify Marxism as a legitimate hermeneutics for understanding the Bible. Similarly, Pope John Paul II, who made more visits to Latin America than any other previous pope, issued multiple dire warnings to clergy about political activism. In the United States, the Committee of Santa Fe, made up of President Ronald Reagan's Latin American advisors, issued the document, A New Inter-American Policy for the 80s. Here, liberation theology was specifically identified as a communist threat, and the committee urged that, quote, U.S. policy must begin to counter, not react against liberation theology. On the other side, advocates passionately defended liberation theology. According to Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador, faith and the activities of the church have always had socio-political repercussions, and Christians have always had an influence upon the socio-political makeup of the world. In this spirit, he argued that the church must be the voice of the voiceless, a defender of the rights of the poor, and a fully engaged partner in the struggle to achieve a more just society. Although Romero was critical of Marxism's violent and atheistic historical forms, he also argued that Marxism could be understood as a scientific analysis of the economic and social order. Thus, Marxism can serve as an effective method of criticism against structural violence. In his defense of liberation theologians, he gave an impassioned call for justice and for the preferential option for the poor, arguing that the fight against poverty and for the poor is political. The church, according to Archbishop Romero, had opted for the truly poor, and because it had opted for those who are truly oppressed and repressed, the church lives in a political world, and it fulfills itself as a church also through politics. It cannot be otherwise if the church, like Jesus, is to turn itself toward the poor. The option for the poor is a choice to be in favor of life or to be in favor of death, and thus for the church and for the faithful, neutrality is impossible. As historian Philip Berryman argues, liberation theology was a critique of an economic structure that enabled some Latin Americans to jet to Miami or London to shop, while most of their fellow citizens did not have safe drinking water. For liberation theology supporters and detractors, the debate continues. What is the boundary between politics and religion? What is the duty of a Christian in an unjust world? Can Christian action be separate from politics? Is there such a thing as apolitical Christian action? Can or should one simply feed the poor and not ask, why are people poor? Can or should one simply dig for new wells, but not ask, why is there no clean water? Does religion exist exclusive of political interest? And similarly, can politics exist exclusive of religious interest? Thank you.
You should all be duly impressed that I asked 4 academics who have never said anything in less than 50 minutes in their lives to be able to each give a 7-minute presentation, and they did it. So I'm very impressed. Very impressed. I expect you to keep on discipline here. Knowing that it was a rather interesting form of cruel and unusual punishment to ask them to keep to 7 minutes apiece, I asked them to work out with one another to ask one another questions which they will answer in 3 minutes apiece. All right? Which can allow them to develop themes yet further or whatever. Who would like to go first?
I'll go first since Steve spoke first. I want to ask you about your favorite flavor in presidents, and it's Abraham Lincoln.
Still 3 minutes.
But my question goes at least 3 minutes also. Besides problems that Lincoln would have with his appearance and beard, how do you think, how would Lincoln's religious language and rhetoric be received today in our current electorate?
That's poorly. I think Lincoln would be received much less well today than he was even received in some quarters in his day. One brief, for instance, after Lincoln gave his second inaugural address, which was 703 words, and took him less than 10 minutes to deliver, he wrote a letter to a relatively new political ally in New York, the journalist Thurlow Weed, and he said, Lincoln called everybody by their last name, just Weed, Smith, whatever. So he writes this letter and he says Weed, which it may be using today too. And he says Weed. Thank you for your comments about my speech. I agree with you. I think it may be my best effort ever. But he said, I don't think it will go over very well. I don't think it will be very popular. He said, after all, men don't like having it pointed out for them that their purposes aren't necessarily the same as God's purposes. Now, having said that, Lincoln didn't claim by any stretch of the imagination to speak for God. That was one of the key things he I think worked very hard at trying to avoid. But again, that focus of his on, there is this power in the world, there is God, there is something that he would refer to as divine providence. He was clearly affected by the Civil War, the death of his two sons, when he was often encouraged to speak in religious terms. For example, in September of 1862, ministers from Chicago visit Lincoln. You have to issue this proclamation, freeing the slaves. And Lincoln said, and moreover they said to him, because God has told us to tell you what to do. And Lincoln, who had this fantastic sense of humor, which was often colorful. I wish I could tell you the quote about what he once said about a minister, but I'd probably get fired. But he said, it's interesting, gentlemen, that you would come to me and tell me that God has spoken to you to tell me what to do. He said, I'm the one who's making the policy here. You'd think if God had it figured out, he'd tell me himself. And he said, he hasn't. And then he said, today is not the day of miracles. So I'll wait for when it's politically prudent to do what needs to be done. So, Lincoln didn't use much God talk. Maybe being the astute politician that he was today, he would have to use more God talk. I would like to hope that he wouldn't because of his integrity. One of his greatest lines, and I'll stop with this, is, when he's going to be inaugurated and he stops off at these state capitals and he speaks in Trenton, New Jersey to the state senate and he refers to the United States as being God's almost chosen people. His was more of a prophetic religious stance than a priestly religious stance. His was more of challenging the people than applauding them for being so good. And yet he put so much in the tentative. It wasn't the claiming the truth. It was, if we're being cursed by the Civil War because of the sin of slavery, he said we still have to say, and I'm paraphrasing the second inaugural really roughly, he said we still have to say the attributes of God are worthy and good in spite of what we've been doing. So Lincoln, I think, would probably have a short political career today in that regard.
Would you like revenge?
Oh, just spite. No. I would like to ask
which I would get fired for.
This political culture, traditional, rational, defensible term in political analysis. I know of your knowledge of and interest in Idaho politics, and I'm just, I guess, curious, if nothing else, about how you see both the consistency and the change in Idaho political culture over recent years. Will it change any as we move forward in terms of here's the north, here's the southeast and the southwest? Ideology is still there, and yet you can see where people stand up at times, how they put together, not necessarily right and left, but they're conservative Catholics, they're conservative Mormons, they're conservative Baptists, and liberal accordingly. Just how constant this focus on political culture is, and how much you see it changing at all. If that makes sense.
I'll make it make sense. What's interesting is Professor Elazar categorized all the states by their subculture. Some were a single subculture, some were a mix. And he this is the way he characterized Idaho. And he did this in the 1970s, having, I don't think, ever crossed the Mississippi River or ever met anybody from Idaho. So I think that there is a constancy there, but it kind of ebbs and flows as a pendulum goes back and forth. It's interesting. You talked about Catholics and other denominations here. How if you go back 6 years from this year, we had a gubernatorial and a lieutenant governor's race. All 4 of the major candidates were Catholic. If you go back 4 years, it was a Catholic and a member of the LDS Church. So I find, and of course the first Jewish governor in the United States was from Idaho. Again, I don't see one subculture reigning over the other. It goes back and forth some. I think if you go back to the 1960s in Idaho with the movement by Barry Goldwater, and you get Don Samuelson as governor, it was much more of a libertarian frame. I could argue that at times when you have even members from different parties, a Cecil Andrus or a Phil Batt would be seen more as moralistic in their approach, whether it was to the environment, society's responsibility to the environment, or Phil Batt, the society's responsibility to farm workers. So I think it swings back and forth. I don't think you go one way completely or the other. And Idaho is still, I do disagree with my former professor. If you'll forgive me, he looked at Idaho and he said it was moralistically dominant with an individualistic strain. I think he had it a little bit backwards. I think he had it backwards. He wouldn't agree with that now anyway.
Thank you. Brent, you would like to go first.
So, the question that I have for Brent is if you could expand upon your initial point that all politicians and most legislation is religious. Expand upon that and
Yeah.
my question's short.
My answer will be long.
My answer will be short. I think part of, as a theologian, it's often thought that I do a lot of religious speak. But I would dare to say part of the problem is we think that religious speak or discourse has to use the word God or church or moral. And I would say that I imagine a lot of my colleagues in political science do is actually religious, in the notion that when we value rights, how do we know when we make a position on something, whether it's abortion or healthcare or whatever, we make those decisions, where do those things come from? And I do want to press against the notion that there's some kind of goods there that we draw from. Well, how do we know there's a good? So on the abortion issue, what are individual rights, government rights, what does it mean to be a person? All those things are inherently driven by some metaphysical faith narrative, right? And you might be an atheist or agnostic, But whenever you make a decision on, well, a person is this, that comes from some narrative, a faith that you hold to by faith. I'm pushing against the notion that there's a reason there. Why don't you use faith here? I've reasoned it out to be true. Well, if somebody else reasoned it out to be different than that, well, then you have a problem there. So what I want to do is, at least as a theologian, say, isn't lots of what we do religious discourse? When we claim the goods or the rights or what is person, that too often we say, I mean, a classic example is, I'll say the abortion issue. And folks say, we know those raving fundamentalists who have the Bible, they're just religious crazies. But my position is rational. Great, but just to know that your position that is rational is driven by some epistemology that you give faith to. How do you know it's true? You can't prove it. And so I think that's where I just want to have a level of honesty to say I think there's more religious discourse than just we talk about God or church or Jesus, that a lot of where values come from have a faith component to it. Question for you. The preferential option for the poor. It feels like most Roman Catholics are not going to deny that. And yet, I love this quote here from Archbishop Helga Camara. When I give to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they are poor, they call me a communist. And so I think about Roman Catholicism. So help me understand the Roman Catholic Church. So we're going to care for the poor.
I want to hear that too.
And I think especially about Paul Ryan issue, and is he a real Catholic or not? I mean, this is really interesting to me. And Joe Biden, right. I mean, that conversation is who's a real Roman Catholic here. Would the Catholic Church opposed to, like, so what do they count as political activism? Because you could feed them, but you couldn't ask questions about politics. There's certain types of activism. Where was the line how the church decide on, coming down on Romero for, we can feed these folks, just don't ask why they're poor. How did they discern how to really care for the poor?
I think this is a really an interesting question, in part because in the decades before liberation theology and even before Vatican II, the Catholic Church was advocating through Catholic action a movement, an encouragement of Catholic laity to engage in the political process. We have like the upsurge of Catholic democratic parties. They call them, and we have them all over Latin America and in other parts of the world as well. So there is this, on the one hand, push to engage the laity in the political process, engage the laity in participating in political decisions, encouraging them to establish political parties. Yet, with liberation theology, the line seems to be the Marxist discourse. Anything to do with Marxism, or at least a semblance of Marxism, that becomes the line. So this, and it's a pretty hard line. It's a pretty hard line that the church took. And this is still going on as a debating point throughout Latin America, because liberation theology has not died, despite contrary to reports in the news. It is still very much alive in various parts of Latin America, especially in parts of Brazil. It has not gone away, and yet this is still a contentious issue. So it is what the church perceives as political, what type of political ideology the priests are engaged, priests and nuns, because nuns were a critical component. Priests and nuns are engaging in, still are very much so. Yeah, the nuns.
Not much more than the priest.
Yeah, very much so. In the United States as well. And that's where they're getting in trouble. So the line seems to be, again, this is, even when some of these priests and nuns are not saying that they're liberation theologians, just the discourse that they're engaged in, what they're saying, the questions that they're asking, if it has semblance of liberation theology, there's a pushback. So where is that line? Well, it seems to be Marxism, or at least any semblance of Marxism.
Very good, thank you. And once again, thank you for your time management so that I didn't have to manage it. You have all had cards with you, I hope, available to you. I hope you've taken time to write down questions as they have come to your mind, because now it's time to turn them in. So if you would, please send them this way. Phil and Greg will collect them and collate them and turn them into representative questions that I can ask. And so would you please do that for now? While you're doing that, I'll give you a moment in case you need to scribble. I do want to add one comment to Mie's recent comment, because many of you may not know that liberation theology is actually very widespread in the United States, in graduate schools of religion and seminaries throughout the country, and it may or may not have significant Marxist overtones depending on where it's played. So it's not while its home is in Latin America, its influence has spread far and wide. So, we get the cards in. Very good. Let's make sure we get those in. You guys are going to have about 10 minutes to edit these into something I can handle, so I'll appreciate that. So, I have one question for all panelists, so here's my question. It's not a great question, but it's the best one I could come up with that all of them could answer.
Then we won't give great answers.
I expect that. My question is, how does your particular perspective on politics and religion inform your thinking about the primary issues surrounding this election season? So, who would like to go? It doesn't. They're completely uninformed.
Would you repeat that again, please?
How does your particular perspective on politics and religion inform your thinking about the primary issues surrounding this election? You can have 2 or 3 minutes on this.
Okay. This is redundant comments. Well, it's a very good question. Obviously, I know you would have asked it, but I'm Catholic, not by birth, but by choice, which most days just drives me crazy. Political schizophrenic. I think the main aspect of my Catholic faith that affects me in this area of my thinking probably comes because of the influence I hope she has on me of Dorothy Day, the Catholic worker movement. She's probably never going to be canonized, but she's one of my saints. And I think she shows to me how religion functions best really more on the margins of power than in the councils of power. And so there's part of me that, I guess on the one hand, demands a lot of these elected officials when they're campaigning to not give me a bunch of political pap or, repeat some catechetical statements to me. And yet, there's part of me that doesn't expect a lot out of them. Because I'm thinking, they're politicians, they're not theologians. But they're running for office, they're trolling for votes. And I think of the spirit of Dorothy Day and this, comfort the afflicted and afflicted comfortable. And I focus, just as myself, I focus more on, I guess, socioeconomic issues than I do on what some might call more moralistic or issues of morality. And I would like to hear them talk about poverty more and not just trumpet the middle class so much. Or, I'm Catholic and I'm Democrat, so I watch the Democratic convention, and it's, GM alive, Osama dead. And I'm thinking, that's the best you can do, I'm glad President Obama's not doing like Bill Clinton and going back to preside over a death penalty of a mentally deficient man, as Clinton did in '92. So I'd like to hear more talk about the likes of the death penalty and poverty, and yet there's part of me that doesn't expect an awful lot different, given the nature of the beast.
Well, I'll follow up on Steve somewhat with a bit of a Catholic background. Dorothy Day, very, very important. My cousin, I call my cousin, we're somewhat cousins, second cousins. It's an Italian thing, you wouldn't understand. My cousin's a Jesuit priest. Some of you might have seen him. He is Father James Martin. He's the chaplain for the Colbert Report. Which means he's not a serious guy. Well, one group that he's supporting a great deal and actually getting a little bit of flack about is the nuns on the bus. Tie into what BA was talking about. And the heat that the nuns are getting from the Pope and the bishops on their asking the same thing Steve is saying. where's the questions about the poor? And they can't get the politicians to talk about it, so they get on a bus and go around the country to speak about that. And that's where I think more of the religious speech be, not litmus tests, not speaking about the quantity of your faith, but somewhat of the quality of your faith. And I'd like to hear, like Steve, hear them show how their faith is reflected in the policies that they're promoting, and whether they support the nuns on the bus or not. So nuns, I always supported the nuns, and if I didn't, they'd crack me on the arm.
I have no religious affiliation. I grew up Buddhist, and I was also, for quite some time, an evangelical Protestant. I have no affiliation to any church today. I study Catholicism largely because of my field in Latin American history. And I think one of the things that that I see in terms of history and as a historian, that the most effective discussions, and I think some of the most profound discussions, happen not in the political sphere, but outside of it. It is in the communities, it is in the local parishes, it is among, a priest with his parishioners, a nun with her sisters, and that's where the discourse is occurring, not so much among politicians. I think that's where some of the most powerful movements also occur. And so what I would like to see, similar to what both Steve and Jasper said, is I would like to hear more discussions about poverty. However, I'm not sure that will happen. But that discussion does need to occur. And instead of relying on politicians, I think it really has to be with the nuns. I think the nuns are probably a great example.
I lived in Chicago for a while, and in Chicago, among Christians, if you were a Republican, you were a child of the devil. I moved to Idaho. Not sure why you're laughing. There I learned that, oh wait, if you're a Democrat, you're a child of the devil. And I am with Christians, quote unquote, a lot, and I find that they don't really need the gospel. They need MSNBC or Fox, which is their true gospel. So as a theologian, I find what's named as religious rhetoric exhausting. It's used to pander and not to inform policy. Steve and I have had more than one conversation about, as we think about, could a Christian really be a president of the United States? What does that mean? So I think, in the end, I'm not convinced, my remarks will make, I think a lot of things are religious, but under the guise of Christianity, a lot of things get said, which I'm not convinced actually connect to what I think the narrative of Christianity is.
So we're all in agreement.
Very good, thank you. Okay, I have collated questions here, which I take to be sort of combinations of actual questions that we can focus on. Here's a nice one that's sort of very broad. Any or all of you can answer these questions, and we'll just, I have 4 here, and we have a little less than half an hour, so you can answer these as you will, and we'll get as far as we get, and we'll be done at 8. When we talk about religion in the U.S., why do we almost always speak of Christianity?
Could be because 80% of the country is Christian, would be one reason. I guess 80% would be a low amount.
I think to be unduly narrow or arbitrary in my answer somewhat, looking at the presidency, it's almost probably, second nature to say, okay, when we're talking about the American presidency, we're talking about these, 44 presidents, 43 men who have been or claim to be Christian. understandable that they speak in religious terms when they campaign for office, because roughly 90% of Americans say they believe in something or someone called God or supreme being. And we know the diversity in this country, religiously speaking, and yet people often slip back into references to our being a Christian nation, again, as if we know what that means or we're in agreement with what that means. One of the things that I find interesting as, I guess, a student of the presidency is, you know, at what point in our lifetimes, or maybe the next generation down, or 5 generations down, we're going to be looking at an occupant of the Oval Office who's not a Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, atheist. When my colleague and I, Dr. Darren Grinder, and I were being interviewed today by Slade, the guy asked me, I don't know if he asked Darren or not, the guy asked me, have we ever had any atheist presidents? And I said, well, not any public atheists. They may have been, they just didn't tell anybody, as far as we know. Most of them didn't even claim to be agnostic, because that'd be a kiss of death politically. So, you know, the references about being a Christian nation are you know, kind of more than off-putting, in part because they're just not accurate, but yet it's kind of an easy label to fall back into using.
And for me, I just want to follow up a little bit on my wisecrack there about the number. I think when you was ever asking about we, I guess you mean the political speakers, and they speak to the majority and or powerful. Why do they always mention the middle class so much? Because there's so many. Why do they speak about tax cuts for the rich? Because they're so powerful. As long as non-Christians don't have power, don't have democratic numbers, you won't hear much political speak on them, just as you don't on many others.
I think a correlation might be the increased discussion in the political debates right now about the Latino population, Latino vote. There's more attention being paid to the Latino vote than ever before. And it is, again, I think, following along what Jasper just said, it is about numbers, it is about, you know, who is holding, in this case, possibly electoral power. Maybe not in this election, but certainly in the coming elections. And so there seems to be a correlation about how politicians at least are talking, and it is to the people who will make a difference in whether or not they get into office.
Just real quick also is that once, say, Muslims are 20% of the population or 15% as Latinos are, or they start giving millions of dollars to super PACs, and we'll hear a lot more about it.
Yeah, real quick. I would just say I find it just not surprising, sadly, but curious over many, probably in the right, whatever we kind of know is that, about Obama's faith. Of course, by the breaking news, by the way, last night, or 2 nights ago, Madonna did declare that Obama was a Muslim. You saw that news. That was a nice clip she gave.
She also said she was a virgin.
She was light. Like her. I just find it just interesting that that being a Muslim would scare so many people. And I just, we could talk about why that is, but I'm just really curious why folks want to say, of course, well, he wasn't born here, and of course, he's not really a Christian. And of course, by default, that means he's not going to be a good president. Just ask questions about that.
I remember seeing a poll recently that that after Obama was elected, then 3 years later, more people thought he was a Muslim. 3 years later, that is, more people thought now that he was a Muslim than actually when he was elected in the first place, which seems like it's a very curious phenomenon to me. I'm not quite sure how to explain it. Let me ask one follow-up question on this that maybe give a point to this. If we had, I don't know, like Gandhi running for president, right? If we have a devout Hindu running for president, is that the kiss of death? Would that person simply not be elected?
You mean like today, this
Today,
year?
right now.
No, that person would not get out of his or her precinct. No, that person would be, you said kiss dead on arrival. No, that person would get nowhere.
He's
And
a
national-
polytheist. I think the American people today would, that's what they, if Obama's a Muslim, then Gandhi would be a polytheist. No, I don't think that would fly.
Impressive question, I can tell. Okay, good. Well, our next question. No, that's the same question. If we don't use reason to arbitrate values debates in the public sphere, what should we replace it with? I think Brent maybe ought to start that, and maybe others of you can help me.
I have no idea. Well, I certainly think reason, I am not an anti-rationalist, but I'm curious, although maybe I am, that's the point. I'm curious how, and I'm not sure, I was talking about what I was going to say tonight, and I was like, well, of course, that's obvious. It's not that we're not using reason, I just want to know that, where does your reason come from? Your reason isn't in some vacuum. You were all born somewhere, you were all raised by certain people, and I'm not convinced by this objectified, neutral, virgin sense of reason. And so certainly we use reason as comprised of our own. I asked myself the question, who in here is not biased? Raise your hand. Right, well, everybody's biased. And that's why the conversation is so important to get enough biases together. Hopefully, the bias can work itself out. So it's not that we're not using reason. I just want to say that where our reason has come from is shaped through some kind of faith, epistemological, metaphysical narratives that we're always not honest about. And I'm not wanting to make a normative claim on which one's better, but I think I am tired of the notion that says, well, come on, we're just going to use reason here. I think that's naive. So we are using reason is good, but you're using reason, and your reason's informed by a lot of other things too.
Other panelists want to address that?
I agree.
You're completely unreasonable lot. If our past leaders, I guess we'll have to personify them in some form, if some past leaders came to see what has become of our country, what would they think about religion and government today?
Depends on who you mean by past leaders.
Big one.
Mather,
Yeah, sure.
he wouldn't think too much of it. Interesting, I would think of, you started with the First Amendment, you think, well, that's James Madison with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Though Madison came kicking and screaming to the Bill of Rights, he did not think that we needed them. Probably, I would think that the past leaders, founders, whatever, say that's not the right question to be asking about as far as religion there, but how are we living up to our values? And I hate the term because we have to deal with it all the time, our mission statement. But our mission statement for the country is the Declaration of Independence. And I think that's what they would ask us about. How well have you lived up to the Declaration of Independence and not so much how we are dealing with religion.
Yeah, I think, so much of it is which past leaders are we talking about? It's not as if all the founding fathers were of one mind on a number of things, including religion. Washington didn't have a big problem, if you will, with establishment. Madison did. Speaking very generally, and maybe somewhat accurately, I think as a rule, those past leaders would say that we've probably let religion inject itself too much into the public square. And that, when we focus too much on, where a president goes to church, or how often he goes to church, or whether he's got a lapel pin, on his jacket, or on her coat, or whatever, puts a hand over the heart, or, what are your theological bona fides,
issues that have, and the debates that have occurred in the Catholic Church. I think that their criticism may be that the Catholic Church has lost sight of what is really important, and that is, of course, the preferential option for the poor. The idea of how to deal with poverty, how to address poverty, not just the idea of feeding the poor. Where do the poor fit in, not just in sort of the economic scale, but where does the poor fit in the political power structure of the world? That was one of the things that they were trying to address. And I think that they would be deeply disappointed in where the conversation has gone.
Yeah, I defer to my political science colleagues and MEA on this, but it sure feels like the religious rhetoric is like smoke and mirrors. It's like it's simply rhetoric. We don't want any substance to it. And we say it to get the votes, but in the end, I think that it becomes, and so it's infused itself in a way, not often with depth of content, but with a little bit of smoke and mirrors. Maybe distracting us from things that are perhaps of more importance, ironically, to what the narrative of religion should be about, as opposed to things they mentioned that often get excused for what religious rhetoric is about. So,
All right, last question, and I have to decode a little bit here, because this is a little bit one-sided, but I think this is probably made two-sided. Several panelists mentioned the individualistic versus communitarian distinction. And Professor Shaw mentioned that Romney tends to lean toward individualistic political ideology, but his profession of Mormonism tends to be a strongly communitarian perspective, and thus, I guess the question is about what do you do with those kinds of inconsistencies, and I suppose we should ask a similar question about Obama in terms of inconsistencies between political rhetoric and faith that he professes, if you perceive any such things.
If I can jump in real quick, because I think part of it was all mine, is I think Romney and Obama have the same dilemma that I discussed about Democrats and Republicans in general. Romney is the individualistic when he's talking about the budget, when he's talking about taxes, but he's more moralistic or communitarian when he's speaking about more social issues. And Obama is the opposite. He's for same-sex marriage, yet is looking for, some would say, redistribution, at least taxing more for the wealthy. So I think both of them run into this conflict that both of the parties are not consistent in their ideology. And I would go back to Jefferson and Hamilton. They were consistent. Jefferson felt from a moralistic, from a societal standpoint, whether it's cultural issues or economic issues, you're individualistic. Hamilton felt there was a big role for government in the economy and in social life. So I think both of them have a trouble, but it's the same trouble both parties have had since the 1930s.
I think they're both at times inconsistent, just I don't know, because of human nature and political behavior and the parties that they're trying to represent. We use labels probably pretty loosely, and yet, you know, as the question pointed out, Romney comes from this particular faith background that does have a strong communitarian element to it. Very highly socially oriented, if you will, and yet, in part because of its history, a bit distrustful, if not fearful, of government, and maybe rightly so when you go back to the likes of the 19th century, right? You know, that's not a great breakthrough on my part, obviously. And from the standpoint, you say, well, here's the argument that says we see ourselves as a certain kind of people. there's our mental map, if you will. How does that relate to how we view the role of government? And that's a debate that, obviously far surpasses a Mitt Romney or Barack Obama or a particular church or a particular historical faith narrative. It goes back to the debate surrounding the beginning of our country. And so I think, Romney, that is his religious background, and yet he's trying to get this party's nomination at a certain time in that party's history. And the very same thing is true for Barack Obama. We've all seen the debate during this campaign of, no, I built it, we built it, no, Bob built it, whomever. And yet, it does reflect differences between them in terms of, well, who are we as a people? It sounds, political sciencey or very political theory-oriented, but it's a chronic and consistent, chronic is not a good word, it's a consistent, if not persistent, question in our country's political history of, who are we as a people? From a Christian standpoint, or a religious standpoint, to put it more broadly than Christian, you could argue it's a debate about, well, who is my neighbor? And how that relates to social welfare policy, governmental structures and conceptions, and how that particular sentiment gets, if you will, effected into public policy. And they bleed into each other. These are not hard and fast categories of you're all this or you're all this. They bleed into each other somewhat, as in part that I pointed out, depending on the issue.
I think in terms of, going back to liberation theology, I think one of the things that is important to note is that when liberation theology emerged, it was in the midst of the Cold War. And in the Cold War, it was a struggle between, of course, the values of communism and versus the values of capitalism, the individual path and individual successes versus what is, community-oriented. So what is interesting about this is that I think the Catholic Church itself has struggled through the 20th century, on the one hand, arguing for a community-based organizations, grassroots organizations, without seeming too communist, while at the same time celebrating capitalism, but and the fact that capitalism is opposition to communism, without celebrating it too much, the selfish side of capitalism. I think that in some ways, and I'll go back to this, what I said earlier, I think if liberation theology was to reemerge right now, the use of Marxist discourse and Marxist analysis would not be the central point of criticism. I think it's a very different world. And so I think in that way, if we take it into historical context, that is really a critical point, the Cold War, and how the world was sort of shaped into black and white, into communism, capitalism.
I am not a Roman Catholic, but I've been strongly influenced in their work on what is ecclesiology and the sacraments. And so I listened to, one of the places where I had to cut out of this conversation was the article concerning Paul Ryan, and how folks, I forget who wrote it, my notes, basically saying, well, his budget, he can't be a Roman Catholic. He isn't,
yeah, that's the nuns said that.
the nuns in the bus? Yeah, and others. And this guy.
And my cousin said that.
And so I just find it interesting. One of the points he made about, and actually an interesting move he made, and which I think about quite a bit, is the role of government versus the role of the church. One of the things that Ryan said was, well, here's the deal. It's the church's job to care for the poor, not the government. Which, to be honest, as a Christian per se, I'm actually not opposed to that. However, you want to ask, well, if the church isn't doing the job, then the poor are left to die. And I don't think the nuns in the bus, I'm not sure how to respond to that actual remark, but I think it's interesting about this balance. And I'm really fascinated, Jasper, by your comments on the Bill of Rights, the protecting the individual, and the commandments protecting the society. And I think I really want to think about that. I think there's a lot of there's a lot of truth there. I think to think about this balance and tension between I'm fine, poor, deal with it, and how we then cross those lines between economic policies versus moralisms. And I think there's a great conversation needs to occur of all religions, since we're all religious, whether you like that or not, about how do we navigate, where's the disconnect there? But I just find it interesting this way, which, folks think, look, you're not Roman Catholic. You say, well, sure I am. So I think it's interesting about this tension between the role of the government in caring about the individual versus the role of the government caring for the community, and how it connects to economic policy versus moral, quote-unquote, moral categories. So I think it's a very fascinating conversation that isn't often dug down real deep and just decide, well, that's a Republican budget, that's a Democratic budget, and we don't have discourse beyond just kind of partisan,